Okay, everybody, let's get started with our next lecture today. So today we're going to be talking about Chapter 4 again, our summer microbiology course. That's BIOL 2010. Now, last time we were talking about prokaryotes, and I went over things like bacteria and archaea, and we talked about what do those types of cells have, what don't they have, and what is a prokaryote. Today, we're going to focus on eukaryotic cells and microorganisms. Again, Chapter 4. Now, we might recall that a prokaryote is an organism that's composed of cells that are relatively simple. There's no nucleus or brain of the cell. There's not a lot of internal structure, only simple activities, and prokaryotes are single-celled or colonial, living in small groups. Now, eukaryotes or eukaryotic cells, organisms composed of eukaryotic cells, are known as eukaryotes. Eukaryotic cells are more advanced. So, for example, we humans and plants and animals and fungi are all eukaryotes. So, in a sense, us biologists here are just a bunch of cells that talk about other cells, right? Your body's made up of cells, and we're talking about other cells. So, eukaryotes are composed of more advanced cells we call eukaryotic. These are more advanced. They contain numerous membrane-bound organelles. Now remember, organelles are the parts inside of a cell. Many organelles have a membrane around them, others don't. We may recall that prokaryotes can have organelles, but not those with a membrane around them. Eukaryotes can have any kind of organelle, with or without a membrane around them. And many organelles in eukaryotes are highly specialized. They have specific functions. The genetic material in eukaryotic cells is contained in a nucleus. And this nucleus has a membrane around it. So the genetic material is contained in a membrane-bound nucleus. Now, both C and D do not apply to prokaryotes. Because of C and D, eukaryotes are capable of a greater variety of activities. They can also be single-celled, which we call unicellular, or eukaryotes can be composed of many cells, which we call multicellular. What's an example of a eukaryote? Anything that's not bacteria or archaea. Anything above bacteria or archaea. All right? So, examples include protists. Protists are single-celled eukaryotes and multicellular algae. So, single-celled eukaryotes, like little critters you might see in pond water under the microscope, and also multicellular algae is included in here. So seaweeds. Fungi are yeasts, which are single-celled, and molds and mushrooms, which are multicellular. Multicellular plants are eukaryotes, and multicellular animals are eukaryotes. Now, in a microbiology course like this, pretty much it's protists and fungi that we're going to be focusing on here. Okay? Now, here we see a typical animal cell. Now, notice this animal cell. This is eukaryotic. It has a much more internal structure here. All these different organelles we can see all over. This big, large ball in purple represents the nucleus, kind of the command and control center of the cell. All these internal structure we did not see in prokaryotes. And a plant cell for comparison, again, lots of organelles in here, a nucleus, lots of internal structure, which again was lacking in the prokaryotes we saw in the last chapter. Here are some other examples of eukaryotic cells or infections that can be caused by eukaryotes. Should be mostly fungal infections. Okay, now I want to start with, if we go back here briefly, I want to start with protists and take a look at them. All right, now because this is microbiology, we're not going to deal so much with seaweed here, multicellular algae, but it's these single-celled eukaryotes that are very, very relevant to microbiology. Now, protists come in basically two flavors. The first main group of protists that are relevant to microbiology or disease or infection are protozoans. Now, protozoa, plural, or protozoans, plural, protozoa are protists that resemble animal cells. They're single-celled and sometimes colonial, living in small groups, and sometimes not. Now, because they resemble animal cells, they don't have a cell wall, they lack cell walls, and they are what we call heterotrophic. Now, that's an important term, everyone. Heterotrophic means that you have to eat other things. You cannot make your own food internally. You have to eat other things. And protozoans often feed by phagocytosis or filter feeding. Phagocytosis is where a cell engulfs food particles. So the membrane surrounds a particle, it engulfs it and pulls it into itself. Or it can just filter particles out of water. But the important part is they have to eat other things. Okay? Protozoa are typically found in moist environments, often completely aquatic, like the ocean or a pond or a stream, but it could be on land in a moist environment. Here's where you might find them. Fully aquatic environments, freshwater, saltwater, moist soil, perhaps beach sand, if it's got some liquid water on it, dead material, decaying organic matter, and even in your mouth. Remember, some protists can be part of your normal flora. In the oceans, we call protozoans zooplankton. These are free-floating in aquatic ponds, streams, lakes, and particularly the ocean. So in larger bodies of water, a pond, a stream, a lake, and again, particularly the ocean, these protozoans are known as zooplankton. Now, most protozoans are highly beneficial. They form the base of many food chains, again, especially in the oceans. Some of them can decompose dead organic matter. Many feed on bacteria, which helps keep bacterial populations from exploding and getting out of hand. Many protozoans can survive in harsh climates. So a lot of these are highly beneficial, but some of them do cause plant and animal diseases. And you might remember the term pathogenic. Pathogenic means disease-causing. So pathogenic protists are protists that would cause disease. Now, other things about protozoans. The cells themselves often have what are called contractile vacuoles. Now, a contractile vacuole is an organelle. It's an internal part that fills up as water comes into the cell, it fills up, and then when it gets too full, it squeezes or contracts and shoots the water back out to the environment. All right? Now, here's what contractile vacuoles look like. They often look like little bubbles here in the cell, but those fill with water and then contract to remove water. Protozoans are very diverse, no longer considered one kingdom. So you have your protozoa, there's all these different groups of them. They often can move about by flagella, long tails. Cilia are little tiny hairs, like around this organism here. Or pseudopods. Pseudopods are kind of an extension of the cytoplasm, like we see here around this amoeba. So they can move by long tails, little hairs, or extensions of their cytoplasm. Some can't move at all, and they would have to rely on the wind, water, animals, or something else to transport them. Also, many protozoans have very complex life cycles with multiple life stations or particular time periods in their life that are different from all the other time periods. All right? Many of them, because of this complex life cycle, many of them are polymorphic, which means they can change their body shape at different points in their life cycle. So early on in their life, they may look like one shape, and then later in life, they may look like something completely different. So they're polymorphic, more than one body shape or form. They often have what's called a trophozoite, which is a feeding stage that can move. And if times get tough, many protozoans can form what's called a cyst, which is a very hardy, dormant stage, kind of like endospores in bacteria. So these can last a long time in a dormant stage. Conditions improve, the cyst can grow back into a full individual. So you can kind of get a little flavor here for some protozoans. These are red blood cells. Here's a malaria parasite among them, and so on. Okay? Now, because these things can be polymorphic and have multiple different major periods in their life, it can be difficult to make effective vaccines and drugs against them. Because a vaccine or drug against one life station, or say against the trophozoite, might not work against the cyst or a different life station. Here are some examples of ones that can cause disease. Trichomonas vaginalis is a parasite that causes primarily vaginal, but also urinary tract infections. Note the flagella on here. This is Giardia, which is a pretty nasty digestive parasite. It probably isn't going to kill you, but you might wish you were dead while you have it. Okay, it's a parasite that causes digestive disorders. Note the flagella again. These are also flagellated protozoans. These are red blood cells here. This is trypanosoma. Notice the flagella here. And this is a blood parasite that causes a deadly disease called African sleeping sickness. Here are some that move by cilia. This paramecium here is not parasitic. It's very common in freshwater. Notice all the cilia around it for movement, also for feeding. Here we see it again here, and two of them together. Okay. This is one called stentor. Kind of looks like a cone, but we can see the cilia around the top of the cone here. Here are some that move by pseudopods. Look at this amoeba. There's the nucleus here, and this animal is moving this way, okay, this way. We see the extensions of the cytoplasm here. Here are others. Some of these ones that move by pseudopods have little shells around them. So this is the shell around what was called a radiolarian. Inside here in life would be something that looks like this, and the pseudopods would extend through the holes. A heliozoan. These foraminiferans here, again, look at the pseudopods coming out of the shell here. Okay. The pseudopods are projecting through a calcium carbonate shell. Fossilized shells become a large part of these white cliffs you see in the background. And this is an extremely deadly organism. Some of you may have heard of Naeglerii fowleri, which is a deadly, what they call a brain-eating amoeba. It literally is found in warm freshwater systems, can enter through the nose. Usually it's not an issue. Sometimes it can make its way to the brain, where it literally starts consuming neurons in the brain. This has about a 99% fatality rate. So it's a very, very deadly organism. Okay, here's just showing a bunch together again. Some more diseases, parts of the world. Remember, most protozoans do not cause disease, but some do. Now, remember, protozoans are sort of one flavor of protists. The second flavor is algae. Okay? Algae are protists that resemble plant cells. They can be single-celled, they can live in groups, we call colonial, or they can be composed of more than one cell, we say they're multicellular. Now, because these organisms, these protists resemble plant cells, they are what we call autotrophic. Again, a very important term. Autotrophic means you can make your own food internally. The best example of that is photosynthesis. So most algae make their own food through photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is the process whereby algae, plants, and some bacteria can take light energy from the sun, water from the ground, and carbon dioxide from the air, put that all together through a bunch of reactions, and make food out of it, particularly sugar. So autotrophs can make their own food. Heterotrophs have to eat other things. Now, because these are protists that resemble plant cells, they have cell walls, simple or complex cell walls, often found in strictly aquatic environments. Most algae can't move on their own, but some can. In fact, a lot of the single-celled ones can. Almost all algae are beneficial, especially photosynthesis. I should mention that a waste product of photosynthesis is oxygen. So when the plant takes sunlight and water and carbon dioxide and makes sugar out of it, oxygen is released as a waste. And that's where Earth gets its oxygen from. So almost all are beneficial or harmless. Again, they form the base of many food chains, particularly in the oceans. They convert energy through photosynthesis and give off oxygen. They can produce a media called agar, which we use as a thickening agent, both in the microbiology laboratory and as a food additive, and other useful chemicals. Some are used as food, like seaweed. Very few are pathogenic. The ones that are can release neurotoxins, toxins affecting the nervous system, or cause digestive or liver problems. Now, primarily in the oceans, we refer to single-celled and colonial algae as phytoplankton. Now, big multicellular algae we call seaweed. But the single-celled algae and the colonial algae in lakes, streams, and especially the ocean, we call phytoplankton. And they're responsible for making about 65% of Earth's oxygen through their photosynthesis. So that is an amazing amount of oxygen and a huge benefit of these organisms. Algae are classified by their color and the pigments that they use during photosynthesis. Here are some examples. So we have a yellow-green algae, a golden algae. These are both colonial. And then these are really pretty here. These are called diatoms. Their cell wall has some silicon in it, the element silicon, Si, which is used in glass making. And that's why they kind of have a glass-like appearance to them. This is a very large colonial, it's still microscopic, but relatively large, called volvox. They look like little green globes. Here we see one here. This is called Chlamydomonas. Note that can move by two flagella here. The green color tells us it's photosynthetic. Now, the multicellular seaweeds, we're not really going to cover much in here, but just for completeness, here's a green algae, another green algae. This is a red algae. These are almost strictly marine, saltwater. And Spirogyra is a freshwater one. Look at these spirally internal structure there, these spirally chloroplasts for photosynthesis. Brown algae is some of the biggest. Sometimes it's referred to as kelp. Okay, it can be huge algal algae in the oceans. Here's some more. Dinoflagellates are a motile type of algae. You see, they move by one flagella, one tail. And when their populations explode, when they get too many of them, they cause what's called an algal bloom. Okay, and these can be deadly. Okay, what can happen is you get so many of these dinoflagellates all together, their population just explodes, and they use up all the oxygen toward the surface of the water, leading to massive fish kills, as shown here. This is called a red tide when they explode, because you get this reddish color here. Okay, here's another one called Euglena, very, very common in freshwater ponds. Ochromonus here is a motile brown algae that's single-celled, or golden brown rather, and just a whole bunch together. All right, so that's an overview of protists. Now let's shift gears a little bit to fungi, okay? Now, fungi can best be described as eukaryotic, non-photosynthetic heterotrophs. Now remember what you've learned. Eukaryotic, they're composed of more advanced cells, cells with a nucleus, cells with organelles that have membranes around them. They can be single or multicellular. They're non-photosynthetic, which means they can't make their own food. And if they can't make their own food, they're a heterotroph, which means they have to eat other things. Where do fungi get their food from? The ground. They absorb nutrients from the ground or from dead organic matter, generally non-motile. And all fungi have cell walls composed of a polysaccharide, carbohydrate, called chitin. Now, fungi fall into two basic categories. First, you have yeasts. Yeasts pictured here. Here's some yeasts under the microscope and even more zoomed in. Yeasts are single-celled, unicellular. They live in small groups, colonial, and they can move about. They are also what we call facultative anaerobes. Now, an anaerobe is something that can live without oxygen. Facultative kind of means either or. So yeast can live with or without oxygen. So that's one type of fungi. The second group is filamentous fungi. These are larger, they're composed of more than one cell, and they do need oxygen. They're aerobic. What are they? Molds, mildews, and mushrooms. And a mildew, everyone, is basically just a mold that prefers a damper or moister conditions. Now, very importantly, filamentous fungi are composed of chains of living cells that form long threads, where one cell is right after the other, after the other, after the other. These chains of living cells that form threads are called hyphae, and a whole group of hyphae of these threads is called a mycelium, or mycelia, plural. Now, most of these threads, these hyphae and mycelia, are underground. During certain times of the year, hyphae, strands, come together to form structures. They might form what's called a thallus. which is a non-reproductive body. And then in turn, the thallus can form fruiting bodies, which are reproductive structures that make spores. A spore is a small packet of DNA surrounded by a tough outer layer. And the spores can dissipate out in the environment. If they land in suitable conditions, they can start to grow new hyphae and into a new mycelia. So for example, when you see a mushroom in your yard, most of the mass of that organism is underground. It's all the hyphae, the mycelia. When you see the mushroom, that's the mycelia, the threads, coming together to form that mushroom, which has a stalk, which is the thallus, and that top umbrella part is the fruiting body that makes spores. So fruiting bodies are produced regularly, usually annually, for normal reproduction, not in times of stress, for normal reproduction. So here we see hyphae here. Look at this chain of living cells, one after the other, and then it branches. And a whole group of them is a mycelium. Here we would see these underground. When you see mold, like the mold on these strawberries, all that fuzzy stuff is hyphae, mycelia. And if you ever notice mold, it's kind of like if I took a cotton ball and just stretched it and pulled it apart, it'd be kind of fuzzy and thready. That's mold. Now, fungi have unique sterols. Remember, a sterol is a type of lipid. Unique sterols in their plasma membranes. It's called ergosterol. Okay? And it looks like this. So here's the ergosterol that's attached to this plasma membrane here. So ergosterol is only found in the plasma membranes of fungi. There are thousands of species that come in all shapes, sizes, and colors. Fungi live best in semi-aquatic, not too wet, not too dry, temperate, not too hot, not too cold climates, which is here. Okay, where we live, molds, mushrooms, yeast do quite well. It's pretty average climate. Sometimes fungi, interestingly, can be dimorphic. Now remember, morphic or morph referring to body, shape, or form. Di meaning two. So two shapes are formed. Now dimorphic fungi have both a filamentous stage of their life cycle, where they grow by hyphae, and a yeast stage of the life cycle, where they're single-celled. For example, one fungus grows in high nitrogen environments, so it prefers bird or bat feces as a mold. So in high nitrogen environments like fecal matter, of any kind really, it grows as a mold. Well, that mold can produce spores. Remember, the fruiting bodies make spores. If those spores are inhaled, it develops into a yeast form inside the body of an animal or human. And this can cause a pneumonia-type infection, something called a fungal pneumonia, for example. This kind of shows that dimorphic fungi in a little more detail. Here's some examples. Rhizopus is a very common bread and fruit mold. A morel, these are considered a delicacy, very high-end, expensive mushrooms. Sacroscypha here looks like little bowls. This is one causing a disease called leaf curl. See, the fungus has infected these leaves. Here we see shelf fungus, and this one here, shelf fungus, kind of grows off the side of a tree like a little shelf. You might have seen a boleus here, and here's a puffball. We squirt that, all the spores come out. Mushrooms sometimes form rings around trees. Remember, most of the mass of this organism is all underground, all the hyphae. These are just the fruiting bodies you see. It's called a fairy ring. And one more here. Agaricus, a common store-bought mushroom. Again, that puffball. This one here is known as black mold, which is a common mildew found in homes. That's bad news. You got to get experts into company into do mold mitigation, because that is not good for your house. Penicillium is the fungus we make penicillin from. This is called bird's nest fungi, and I think you can see why. This is an extraordinarily deadly mushroom called Amanita. It's called a death angel or a destroying angel. Very, very deadly, very toxic. Truffles are mushrooms that grow underground. You may have heard of truffle oil. Very expensive. This is the honey mushroom, which is considered the largest living organism on Earth. It's in eastern Oregon, 3 feet underground, covers about 2,000 acres, weighing hundreds of tons, and is probably up to 7,000 years old. It's all big, huge mass of mycelium. All right? Now, what about ecological importance and benefits? Fungi, everyone, are very highly beneficial. The main thing they do is decompose dead organisms and organic matter. And very interestingly, fungi can decompose what's called lignin. Lignin is a key component of wood. And they can decompose other compounds that bacteria can't. You might remember from the last chapter, bacteria and fungi are your big groups of decomposers. They are responsible for decomposing dead organic matter and breaking it down. Well, bacteria can decompose some things that fungi can't, and fungi can decompose some things that bacteria can't, especially lignin, this key component of wood. So how would Earth's landscape look different without fungi? You should ponder that. Fungi can also break down rock to form soil. They can form symbiotic relationships with many organisms, especially agricultural plants, where fungi can form a mutually beneficial relationship with plant roots called mycorrhiza, where the fungi grows around or sometimes even inside the plant root, and it helps the plant absorb water and nutrients from the soil. In fact, most young plants will not live for very long without this connection to soil fungi. They can't absorb enough water and nutrients to sustain their growth. Lots of foods are fungi. You can probably think of some now, like here. Mushrooms, cheeses. If you like blue cheese, the blue in blue cheese is mold. Don't forget that yeasts are fungi. So think about everything that's made from yeast. Okay? Baked goods, everything. Okay? Fungi can ferment sugar to ethyl alcohol. That's again yeast. Think about how important that might be for wine, beer, and other alcohol, that industry. We use fungi for a lot of therapeutic compounds. Cyclosporin, for example. Antibiotics like penicillin is made from Penicillium, which is a fungus. Here we see bacteria growing on this agar plate. This is the Penicillium fungus that makes penicillin. And you'll notice that there's a clear area around this fungus in which no bacteria are growing because the penicillin is killing it. Fungi can also be used to make industrial solvents and pesticides and many other things as well. Now, that being said, there's always kind of a good and a bad to these microorganisms. Some fungi do cause problems. These would be pathogenic fungi. They can cause plant infections, like this corn smut or ergot infection here of this rye. They can cause animal and human infections. Now, the good news is usually fungal infections are superficial, meaning they're confined to the skin, hair, or nails. Some are systemic. They get into the body, and that's a little bit more serious or a lot more serious. So things like this is a yeast infection here on the tongue and mouth, ringworm, athlete's foot, all fungal infections. Some are outright toxic and deadly, like this destroying angel. Others cause food spoilage and rot, and still others might do more than one of these. So while there's a good side to fungi, there's also a negative side. Mostly quite good. Anything on this list here is impressive. Okay? All right, everybody, so that's it for the chapter on eukaryotic microorganisms. Next time, we'll take a look at viruses and prions. So until then, have a nice rest of the day, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.